without further ado, I'd like to have a nice warm welcome to Connie Rathbone, and let's give her a nice warm welcome and look forward to a great presentation. You're a hugger.
I'm a hugger, not a shaker. Boy, Kevin, those were some very assertive comments. You know, if Kevin was a woman, they would call him bossy, and if he's a guy, it's just assertive. Kevin and Jonathan and I joined on the emergency preparedness panel yesterday, and it was pretty fun, just talking about what you do in the event of an emergency. And of course, I'll start with my opening, because I was going to talk about boring contract stuff, and you know how I hate to talk about boring stuff. So we started off with this question. Put your fork down for just a second, and if you ever purchased an insurance policy or signed a trust deed or any other loan document or a lease or a purchase and sale agreement. Okay, hands up for anybody that has done that. Come on, everybody's going to have their hands up. Okay, now leave your hands up. Leave your hands up. If you read every word of any of those documents, you can take your hand down. Oh, come on. That's just a bold-faced lie, you guys. I don't believe that for a second. And so my advice on emergency preparedness is don't do that. Read all of your documents, because they all have something in about what's going to happen in the event of an emergency. There's my little spiel on emergency preparedness. Because there are lots of questions, I will respond to the name change. We are the same company, different name. Jim Zupancic is off doing his own thing now, and so it was time to give some name recognition to our George is here, so I won't say baby lawyers, but to our junior partners. So it's Rathbone, Barton, Olson going forward, and we're excited about the future. Very busy. George Dingledine is a lawyer with our office. He does, you can feel sorry for him right now, because he works with me every day, day after day, and does a great job on business work. So I would like to introduce Keith Lampe. I've known Keith for several years and have known of his company for many, many more years. And by the way, David, when you're introducing a woman, don't put quite so many manys in the years that you've been working with them. It's a little disconcerting. So Keith was the Director and Chief Operating Officer of Inland Private Capital Corporation for several years, and is now the president as of January 2015. In my new position as president of Rathbone Barton Olson, I can commiserate a little bit with Keith about this promotion that he got, because it adds with it a whole lot of responsibility. But Keith is a great guy. Inland has been a company that I have referred my TIC clients to for a really long time. I can say many, many years when I'm talking about Keith, because their company has a stellar reputation in the industry. They had a stellar reputation even when it was the TIC industry, and of course now most everything has moved to Delaware statutory trusts. But I think Inland may be the only sponsor in the TIC industry that can represent that they never, I hope this is still true, they never made a capital call on a group of TIC owners. They always covered it themselves, which causes them to be very favorable sponsor with their TIC owners. I haven't worked very much with Keith on the front side, because the people that come to me are the people that are subject to the predators in the industry, and they're not one of those. And so my experience with them has just been primarily in sending clients to them to purchase product on the end after we sell a property. Keith is responsible for directing the company's strategic growth plan while ensuring Inland's core principles, including its investor-focused approach. And that approach is reflected throughout the organization. When I first started working with them, they brought me back to Chicago, and I talked with an awful lot of people at the organization, huge buildings, but man, that investor focus really comes clear. Keith was elected as the board of directors of ADISA, and is president there are you president there right now?
Board member.
Board member, since 2014. Now, ADISA is what you guys remember as TICA, then RISA, then ADISA. I'm not sure there may be another name change here in the near future because that seems to be their -- business purpose, right?
Anissa captures almost everything.
It
So hopefully no
captures
more names
everything.
change, yeah.
Okay. And I always ask people to give me something a little amusing about themselves, and I'm not sure if this piece about Keith is amusing or it's sad. Because he told me that at the hotel last night was the first full night's sleep that he has had in many years, maybe 7 years. And he tried to attribute it to the 3 little children that are in his home, but I actually believe that it may be more attributable to some depression that set in after the Cubs kind of blew it, didn't make it. So
We got game 7 tonight, so it's not over.
it's,
Game
oh,
7.
okay, it's not over. Okay, well, we'll see. In any event, we'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, go ahead and look. Or should,
Go
we're
ahead.
just going to, sit here and.
Perfect.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Should we, can we, does this slide back?
That's probably.
There, can people see now? If we just, yeah, that actually looks pretty well. Go?
How's that?
Yeah, that's good. And let's see if this works. Is it Craig, is it the red button?
I think it's the side. The side one.
Should be the one right with the answer.
There we go. All right. And that one is actually too far for me to see. All right, so, I came up with this really creative title for the presentation. Believe me, I sent out several potential titles and nobody responded, so I just picked. And thank you. So I just picked. And as you all know, I've been working for tenant and common owner groups since 2007, trying to help them out of difficult situations. As I said a minute ago, primarily I'm dealing with predatory managers, but not always. Sometimes the impact is just as a result of the economic decline. So that work is slowing down for me because TIC owners have either been foreclosed on, they've already refinanced their loans, or they're working in some other form of roll-up. And so that industry is sunsetting. Most of the CMBS loans that were delivered to create these purchases were 10-year loans, and so most of them will expire in 2017. So people will likely be out of the TIC structure, into an LLC, into a DST, or will have sold their property by the end. Some of the reasons that the TIC industry is sunsetting is because lenders have learned, or servicers have learned, to hate the TIC industry and the TIC structure, and that's because it is complicated. And because they have multiple borrowers, and it's not something that they relish or like to loan on anymore. You can still get some TIC financing, but it is typically more expensive, and as Keith said, you have to turn over a lot of rocks to find it. Owners have also learned to hate servicers, right? The servicers are the ones that implement the loan and the loan responsibilities and obligations. And the servicers are not like your private neighborhood banker. They are insensitive. They have a bucket of things that they can do, that they're authorized to do, and everything they do receives fees. And so you cannot go and have a heart-to-heart with one of the servicers like you can with your neighborhood banker that says, just hang with me for a little while on this or that. We can sometimes work out extensions or modifications with servicers, but they're always expensive. And it is only if we can demonstrate to the servicer that working with us will return more money to their bondholders. And then sometimes we have to help them understand that they're still going to get their servicer's fees in connection with working with us. The two primary reasons that the TIC structure and the TIC industry has turned down is the economic downturn. You know, many of the properties that were structured would have done all right if it hadn't been for the economic downturn and predatory sponsors. There are a lot of predators out there. As you know, most TIC owners are likely elderly senior citizens, put all their money into a variety of different TIC products, and in many instances have lost them. But the TIC structure in itself was not inherently bad. It was the implementation of it. And the only inherently bad part, and those are the happy or the smiley faces, was believing that 35 senior citizens who did not know each other could work together if things went bad. And so that part is very challenging. I have groups that work just like a machine, and I have groups where, because one TIC owner refused to go along, the whole property failed and went to foreclosure. So it's unfortunate to have a structure like that where you can have one rogue owner cause such a decline, and that's not possible in DSTs, and so that's one of the reasons that they're better. And so if you look at kind of the structure, you remember, owner exchanges into the office building, they exchange out. The restructure of many of these went to the owner exchanging in, and if things went bad and they had to refinance, then there is a 1031 roll-up that went out, and that is when the owners hit their tax wall. And so I always say that the benefit of TICs over the DST is owner control. The owners keep much of the control of the project, and the detriment or the worst thing about TICs is owner control. And so the fact that you have this flexibility to have the owners approve things also causes the biggest problem. As an example, having a property foreclosed because you've got one owner, and this lady's son, she was a senior citizen, her son said to me on the phone, well, we're not afraid of a foreclosure. And I thought, well, why? Why are you not afraid of a foreclosure? If you have losses, go ahead and transfer your interest to another owner and take your losses. Don't ruin it for everyone. But that's not necessarily what happens. So lenders don't want to finance them. The public perception is bad because of the predatory sponsors. A lot of these sponsors made between $1 million and $10 million on the flip. In other words, I buy it on Monday and I flip it to the TIC owners for a $10 million increase. Now, I don't care what property it is. There is no market justification for doing that. So many people were buried from day one in these products, but that was then exacerbated by the economic decline. A lot of these were sold as master leases, and I don't know your view of this, but in my opinion, there is no such thing as a certain or guaranteed lease payment when you have a shell master tenant, right? Tenants go under, people have to put money in. There's too much risk of rogue owners. Owners, in many instances, and I've written a lot of articles on this, learned that they needed to be active investors rather than passive investors. And you can't count on TICs to make capital calls. You know, they wanted this to be a one-time limited investment. They wanted it to be a passive investment, and they never wanted to have to put more money in. They just wanted to clip coupons. And if you own real property, you cannot count on not having to put in money, right? What if we need a new roof and the rents don't justify it? So, because there will always be a market for a passive investment, DSTs have gained in substantial popularity to be a replacement product for tenants in common. So with that, I'm turning it over to Keith.
Thanks, Connie. So, you know, coming in here, and I think when I think about the differences between a TIC and a DST, and that's a lot of what we hope to cover here today, I think from a distance they kind of look similar, right? You've got two vehicles that are a fractionalized ownership structure, and sponsors work toward making sure that from a tax perspective, the real estate's considered like kind for tax-deferred exchange 1031 investors. That's from a distance. So what we hope to do here today, I'm going to go through some of the minutia, peel back a few layers of the onion and hopefully help to convey the structural differences, which, in my opinion, make for a better, more investor-friendly structure. Going back to some of Connie's remarks, the TIC structure in and of itself had some flaws, but a big part of, I think, the stigma that and the broad brushstrokes that it's been painted with had a lot more to do with the people behind the transaction. In some instances, the real estate was good. Management had some challenges. Unanimous consent was obviously an issue. So with that, I'm going to get into the DST a little bit, and then we'll talk about some of the industry trends. So from a high-level standpoint, Delaware Statutory Trust is really not something that's very new. In fact, it dates back all the way to my first bullet point here, the 16th century English common law. So it's been around almost as long as it's been since the Cubs have won the World Series. And according to Connie, it's probably not in the cards today, but we'll see what happens tonight. Where it really began gaining more wide acceptance was in 2004. So a group of industry professionals, Inland included, got together, worked with the IRS to formulate a plan whereby the Delaware Statutory Trust could be considered like-kind real estate for tax purposes. We developed a white paper. We drafted what we felt the structure should look like. The IRS responded within about 18 months, which was a pretty good turnaround time, and came back with what was referred to as Revenue Ruling 2004-86. And it basically gave a roadmap to sponsors like Inland in terms of how to structure deals so that they still do qualify as like-kind real estate. What was interesting about that is the ruling and the IRS guidance came out in 2004, but the DST didn't really begin to gain steam and garner wide acceptance until the Great Recession, largely having to do with some of the lender constraints that Connie touched on earlier. So what are some of the DST benefits? Well, first of all, it is still a fractionalized ownership interest in real estate. You can do a tax-deferred exchange into the vehicle, and then when the vehicle goes full cycle and when we have a monetization event, investors have the ability to then do a subsequent exchange into either another securitized 1031 exchange through a DST or any real estate holding that they see fit. So they really have a lot of flexibility in that regard. It is an absolute passive investment vehicle. The sponsor, in this case Inland, sits as signatory trustee under the trust. We control all decision-making. There are very limited voting rights. In fact, really no unanimous consent required in order to sign a new lease, refinance a transaction, full cycle a transaction. And that's something that, I think at first blush, investors like the idea of having control, but what we've seen in practice when evaluating some of what we experienced in the tenancy and common arena is unanimous consent can be a curse in disguise. We obviously, it's a turnkey solution for an investor, and I think demographic trends are very much on this industry side. An investor that has been buying and selling, managing their own properties for in some instances several decades. Most get to that point in life where they no longer want to be active owners. And they talk to their real estate broker, they talk to their tax professional, talk to their financial advisor. They consider selling and liquidating their holdings. They look at the tax ramifications, and they realize, that's not necessarily an option. In comes the DST as a potential solution for a client in that set of circumstances. Within the DST structure, we're able to set very low minimum buy-ins. We can actually accept up to 2,000 investors per DST. Now, we never come anywhere close to having 2,000 investors in each deal, but what it allows us to do is lower the minimum investment requirement. And when I compare that to the TIC structure, where we were limited to 35 investors, it's a night and day difference. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. And then finally, and this I would hope would resonate with some of the commercial brokers in the room, it's a boot solution. It oftentimes can fill the gap associated with a tax-deferred exchange. So let's say you aren't working with a client that wants to get out of active ownership into a more passive role. You're going to have that opportunity to line up replacement property for them. 99 out of 100 times, that replacement property might not be an exact match in terms of reinvestable equity and debt coverage, the DST is a way to kind of round out the transaction so that you achieve maximum deferral, full deferral from a tax-deferred exchange standpoint. So what is the DST? It's structurally a bankruptcy remote entity. So as we pool investors, and many of these investors don't necessarily know each other, the actions, the financial issues that one investor may be dealing with will never be able to penetrate the veil of the DST. The assets within the trust cannot be pulled into bankruptcy. So it does provide that similar protection that the tenant in common structure allowed. Types of assets that can be put in the DST are numerous. At Inland, we've transacted a wide variety of investment opportunities. Operating assets like multifamily, student housing, self-storage can be worked into the trust structure. We do have to form a master lease, which almost provides that characteristic of a long-term triple net lease, if you will, but it's a workaround that allows us to work operating assets into the trust vehicle. And then we also have transacted triple net long-term bond-like leases. Doing less of that today, given where cap rates and where values are, and we could talk about that a little bit more here moving forward. Big difference here, it's kind of the middle segment of the slide. The TIC vehicle limited your ability to have one piece of real estate within an offering. The DST allows for sponsors to pool multiple assets, and this is something we've really been expanding on as we bring product to market. So it's not uncommon for you to review or look at a Delaware statutory trust offering that doesn't just have one asset in one location. You might have 3, 4, 5 different properties, different markets, which achieve some geographic diversification, different locations. Usually we stay consistent with property type in any given offering. So if you want to look at a residential opportunity, it's going to be a pool of apartment assets. If you're looking at the healthcare sector, medical office, or assisted living, that might categorically fall into one offering. But the option to pool assets and provide investors diversification with one offering is a structural nuance and benefit to the DST structure that we didn't have the ability to bring investors when we were transacting through the tenancy in common vehicle. I touched on the voting rights. And really it is, again, at the end of the day, first and foremost, a fractionalized vehicle. Passive investment is really what a DST is at the end of the day. Last slide on the DST, and Connie touched on it briefly. Lenders love it compared to their kind of distaste for the tenancy in common vehicle. Reason being, it's simple. The trust owns the real estate. A well-capitalized sponsor like Inland is the trustee, which controls the decision-making, kind of guides the bus, so to speak. And the lender does not have to underwrite each co-owner. The lender doesn't have to really worry about each co-owner. Co-owners don't have to sign carve-outs on what's otherwise a non-recourse loan. So the ease and execution from not only an acquisition but also financing deals is tremendously different from when compared to the tenancy in common vehicle. So this just kind of recaps, and Connie and I, as we were preparing for this, wanted to provide a side-by-side comparison, just to recap some of these high-level points. So you can see the DST, as I mentioned, follows an IRS revenue ruling that was issued in 2004. The TIC structure actually followed IRS guidance that was issued in 2002. It wasn't a ruling, it was revenue procedure, less strong from a tax standpoint, but still kind of fit the bill, so to speak. The big focal point in my mind from a practical standpoint, the DST allows us to take in more investors, lower minimums, encourage diversification, and in fact, and I pointed this out earlier, we can have multiple properties within an offering. So from a practical standpoint, if I was working with a client that had $1 million in equity to reinvest in 2007, 2008, I might have had an offering that we were setting out to raise $35 million in equity for. If I'm limited to 35 investors, my minimum buy-in is set at $1 million. It was not uncommon at all for us to see clients put that full $1 million into one offering, one property, one offering, one location, and really have very limited diversification. That also really kind of put a dagger in the ability to round out a transaction that maybe as a commercial broker you were putting together for a client where you were looking to solve for that boot issue. Fast forward to the DST structure, minimum investment is typically set at $100,000. There's a lot of flexibility on that front, so there's just a great deal of user friendliness that goes along with the DST structure, which is something I'm seeing advisors, brokers, financial professionals really take advantage of and implement as they sit down with their client, understand their needs, and kind of go through that asset allocation process. Here's a kind of interesting slide, brief snapshot of the industry and kind of how it's trended. So Connie touched on the TIC era, and when you look at the securitized fractional ownership, securitized 1031 exchange market, it really peaked out in 2006. We actually hit $3.6 billion in equity collections during that year, and it started to taper off a little bit in 07 and 08, and then 2009 Great Recession hit, more or less fell off a cliff, and that was largely tied to the fact that many property owners weren't transacting, weren't selling, and if they were, there was minimal gain that maybe needed to be deferred. What's interesting about this slide, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, you could pretty much draw a line down the middle of this slide between 2008 and 2009, and most transactions leading into 2008 were TICs. Fast forward, the industry kind of went through a cleansing of sorts. The DST structure was a positive outcome of the Great Recession, and from 2009 to 2015, it's almost exclusively Delaware statutory trust vehicles. It's an interesting inflection point we hit last year. The industry broke through $1 billion in sales, and by most projections, the industry is expected to do $1.5 billion in transactions in equity collections this year. So it is trending upward. It seems to be trending upward in a far more measured fashion when you compare the last market cycle. But the industry's definitely come back in a big way, and it's alive and well. And as I said earlier, I think from a demographic standpoint, there's an absolute demand and a need for product types that fit the passive ownership type of role.
Before you go on, one thing I want to emphasize is that what we're talking about sunsetting is the sponsored TIC industry. The TIC structure is still very viable. If you've got 5 guys named Joe, I think that's a band. If you've got 5 guys or five people that want to buy a property and they want to do exchanges into it, that's a very valid thing. Those people are going to know each other. They're likely are going to trust each other, or else they wouldn't be thinking about buying property with someone. So don't delete the TIC structure from your thinking. Just think of it as more of a private, almost partnership type thing, as opposed to a sponsored TIC structure.
That's a good point. And we, over the past 7 or so years, we did actually have involvement in, and we put one TIC transaction together. But it was an outlier scenario. It was a group of individuals that knew each other. It was a family, and we were able to identify one asset that they, as a family, owned 100% of, and we structured that as a TIC. Now, a lot more challenging to find a lender that's willing to play ball there. We did have to go through the underwriting process on each owner. This was a very, very high net worth family, so that wasn't impossible, and we were able to accomplish that. But that was more of a customized kind of outlier scenario. A majority of the normal fluid transactions that we're seeing are falling into the DST wrapper. This next slide, and this is also kind of an important industry focus that I like to point out. When we go back to the prior slide, 2008, $3.6 billion in equity raised. There were almost 75 sponsors, 75 companies transacting deals in the fractionalized ownership, securitized 1031 arena. Fast forward to today, you can count the number of sponsors almost on one hand. In fact, the top 5 on this list make up about 75% of the market. So I think when I mentioned earlier in 2009, we saw the industry cleansing of sorts occur. I think it was a really sobering moment for the entire real estate community, in that this isn't a opportunistic, AUM growth play. This is not for the faint of heart. This industry is for a company that's committed long term, that's well capitalized, that is there for the good times, good there for the bad times. And I don't think, while the financial memory can sometimes be fairly short, I don't think most of the gatekeepers, most of the diligence officers that sort of safeguard against bad actors getting into the fold, most haven't forgotten. And I think that's why you're seeing limited new companies come into the fold. So there will be some, and I'm not saying every new sponsor is a bad sponsor, but there are a lot of barriers to entry to getting into this space. And look, you all know underwriting and believing in the real estate is absolutely important. But again, I can't emphasize it enough. I think the people behind it are equally important, and that's part of what you kind of see prevalent today with the limited amount of sponsors that are providing this type of product. So really brief commercial on Inland, just to kind of give you guys a backdrop on who I am, who the firm is, and kind of what we represent. I'm fortunate enough to work with this company for about 15 years. The owners of Inland, four gentlemen that founded the company almost 50 years ago, still very active in the firm today. They started the company. It was a very kind of grassroots story. They started putting together real estate transactions, raising capital from friends and family. They had some early success. That kind of grew and compounded over time. And then they started going outside of friends and family and raising capital from outside investors. And that's a cultural nuance that still very, very strongly resonates within the Inland brand. These guys put a company together that has a brand of not ever having a capital call, standing shoulder to shoulder, standing behind their investments. And every transaction we bring to market, I say this to my underwriting team every time we're looking at a deal, we stand to lose a lot more than we stand to gain. So let's make sure we get it right. And nobody's going to ever expect us to bat 1,000. Right, you're gonna have some challenges as you transact enough real estate deals, but where you really get judged by performance is not being expected to have a perfect track record, but kind of what you do about it when the going gets tough, and I think that's something that we've been able to demonstrate over the years. That's really something I can't take credit for. That's a cultural kind of subset that the owners of Inland really set and established, and we're still very committed to today. My firm, company I'm president of, Inland Private Capital, is one of the key components of the Inland Group. We're basically kind of in the middle sphere of outside investors. We target accredited investors. So Inland has a public entity that raises capital from retail investors. Most of those are non-listed REITs, and they've had a fair amount of success on that side of the coin. Middle part of the segment where I come in is the accredited high net worth investor, $1 million net worth or greater, and that's a subset that we kind of appeal to. And then we also have an institutional capital group that raises capital from institutional funds, endowments, things of that nature. So Inland casts a fairly wide net in the investment management arena. The focal point here, and when we started this company about 15 years ago, was to identify individual assets or portfolios of assets, bring them to the market in the form of a private placement, appeal to accredited investors, and tax-deferred exchanges are really kind of the driving force behind our capital raising initiative. Here's next slide is kind of an example of what an offering might look like, just to kind of provide some real-time kind of feedback for you. So this was a transaction we put together about 2 years ago. It touches on a lot of the points I made earlier. It's a multifamily portfolio, 3 assets, all in the Denver, Colorado market. About a $180 million transaction. We raised about $90 million from investors. It's performing very well. When you aggregate assets, you pool assets, you provide that embedded diversity to investors. So I did have one instance a couple of years after we transacted. We had a developer put a shovel in the ground not too far away from one of the assets. Developer was going through lease up, giving away the farm in terms of concessions and free rent and iPads and gift cards and flat screen TVs. It was a very, very competitive time for us. We did see our occupancy drop. We saw rents kind of flatline and in some instances drop. By having that bulk and scale of a portfolio, we were able to kind of weather that storm. The group of assets was conservatively underwritten to begin with, wasn't necessarily underwritten to to withstand a blow that substantial, and that was over a 6-month period. But at the end of the day, because of the other two assets, the program performed at pro forma levels. We were able to kind of navigate our way through that storm, and now it's on very, very healthy footing. So, I can't emphasize enough, and this has been a kind of corporate push for us. We've been bringing larger opportunities to market, creating scale and size, and I think in this cap rate environment, in this economic environment, that's even more important. Anything we buy today, I'm expecting to own and manage through an economic downturn. And the deal, the structure, the financing, it all has to kind of contemplate that. And we have to be prepared for a downturn, if you will. And this property definitely, or this offering definitely checked a lot of boxes for us as a good example. From a product perspective, one of the things we go at great pains to be able to provide investors is a menu of alternatives to consider. The time frames associated with doing tax-deferred exchanges are very, very tight, right? You sell your property, you have 45 days to identify, you have a total of 180 days to close. It can be a stressful time, and options are not always plentiful. What we strive to do is provide, at any given point in time, a number of different options, not only from a leverage standpoint, but from a sector standpoint, geography. So this is kind of an example of our menu. About a year ago, we had a student housing asset, we had a multifamily portfolio, we had a triple net lease portfolio leased to Home Depot, and we had a healthcare kind of package of medical office options. Now, from a leverage standpoint, one of them was highly leveraged, two of them were very moderately leveraged, and the third was not leveraged at all. It was an all-cash vehicle. So what this allowed investors to do within their very, very tight time constraints was pick and choose, maybe diversify across all four. Maybe one didn't work, but the other three did. Debt has a lot to do with asset allocation. This is our constant approach and goal, is to have this type of menu available at any given point in time, and we've been fairly successful at achieving that. Going into kind of the market that we're in today, it's obviously a tight cap rate environment. A lot of low-hanging fruit's already been picked. It's not easy to find value. We're looking at acquisitions on a long-term basis, long-term financing, and we've been targeting more in the way of operating assets. So we've been very active in the self-storage arena, multifamily, medical, multi-tenant medical office, as well as student housing, and that's really kind of our focal point here going forward. Go ahead.
One comment: when Keith mentions his highly leveraged product, you should be aware when working with your clients that if they have a TIC product that is going to get foreclosed, they can do an exchange out of the foreclosure. David Moore has worked with us on many of these, and so what you do is, towards the foreclosure date, the owner assigns their LLC to the accommodator, and so the client has the ability to move their debt to a new product and add some cash. Often that cash is going to be less than what they have to pay Uncle Sam if they are subject to the foreclosure, because if your client has a very small or zero basis in their property, if it gets foreclosed, it can be a very bad tax day because they are going to be deemed to have sold at their proportionate amount of the loan balance. And so I will call Bob or someone else and ask if Inland has any very highly leveraged product right now, if I've got a foreclosure coming up, and by the way, I have one right now, so that people have an opportunity to do an exchange instead of having the bad tax result.
That's a good point. That's oftentimes the way the highly leveraged program is used. I'm going to wrap up here. Brief snapshot on Inland Private Capital. So I mentioned we're a big part of who the Inland family is today from an AUM standpoint. We have, actually this slide is dated, we have approximately $6 billion in assets under management across 44 states. So we do have kind of a nationwide footprint. We take a very opportunistic approach to evaluating assets. We certainly have our favorites as it relates to certain markets, but we kind of play that let's leave no rock unturned. We look at a lot more than we make offers on, and we make offers on a lot more than we ultimately end up buying. And the one common theme is we're just very active, we're very consistent, we're always in the market looking for opportunity, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Last point I wanted to make, and I guess I could see that changing sometime soon if we see a change in the tax code. It's something you're probably all fairly familiar with, but Section 1031 exchange is under attack. I think it's getting lumped into more comprehensive tax reform. It's something we should all be aware of. My industry, the 3.6 billion in '08 or the 1.5 billion this year, this is a small spoke in the wheel of the overall real estate market. In fact, I believe the last data point I received was that securitized 1031 exchanges really only represent about 10% of all of the tax-deferred exchanges that go on within the real estate universe. And a repeal or a limitation on that would I think send shockwaves through the commercial and residential real estate market, and it's something we're very focused on. We have a very strong lobbying presence. We're very dialed in at Inland. There would actually have been 2 economic impact studies that have been written to sort of prove out the damaging effect this could have on the broader commercial real estate environment. But it's absolutely something we should all be cognizant of. There's a lot of opportunities to take action. A lot of the qualified intermediaries, many in this room, have websites that you can kind of dial into, write kind of a canned letter to your congressman, and every little bit helps. I think it could be a very grassroots approach, but at the end of the day, it's again something we should all have our eye on. And we got an election in about a week, so we'll see what comes of that. And then I think the fun really starts afterwards in terms of how tax reform gets kind of chopped up. So that's really my comments.
Well, I have a couple of questions to start with, and a couple of things that I know people are very interested in hearing. Can you talk a little bit about the front-end fees that are applicable? Also, how to protect from that scenario where sponsors were making $10 million on the flip. Do you see much clean money coming in? It's a wildly compound question, sorry. And then how do the brokers and folks in this room become involved to make a dollar when almost all of them have given up their security licenses, maybe appropriately, but how do they become involved in the transaction in a fee way?
That was one question, right?
No, it was compound.
All right. So I'll jump around here a little bit. From a clean money standpoint, we do see cash investments all the time go into our programs. The accredited investor, I think, finds a lot of value in hard assets, defined pools of assets, and in many instances, the product structure appeals to cash. So it's an important comment. I want to highlight it because this isn't just a tax deferral structure. The real estate matters. The real estate is bought by high net worth investors outside of just being a tax deferred exchange. What was the next part?
The fees and the
Fees. So fees. This has been a industry hot button coming out of the recession. I think the industry has made tremendous progress on that front. Inland, as one of the market leaders, has been a thought leader in that respect. I would say fees since 2008 have compressed as high as 40-50% today when compared to the peak of the last market cycle. So how does a sponsor like Inland make money? We take an acquisition fee, and then we enjoy or earn management fees ongoing. The commissions paid to securities professionals has been compressed. So all in, where upfront loads were anywhere from 15 to 20% on value at the peak of the last market cycle, those have compressed to 6 to 7.5% on value today. So there's been a tremendous amount of pressure on fees. It hasn't been popular amongst some of the newer, smaller, less capitalized sponsors. I'm not always the most popular guy in that room because we have the benefit of established capacity. We can make up for fee compression through scale. It's not as easy to do if you're just a small shop getting started, which I think is another factor that's presented some barriers to entry. But at the end of the day, the industry, I think, has learned a lot from the downturn. There's a total return focus, and there's a lot of psychology associated with putting together investments. And if you don't have that mindset that not only do investors get that consistent kind of coupon to collect each month, but also how am I going to get investors out at least break even, because that's what investors expect, at least break even or profitably. You're never gonna win your repeat investors. Rollover. You're not gonna have happy investors. So. That's something we've been very, very focused on. We've actually monetized about $1 billion in dispositions. Our track record's been very healthy. Some of those were legacy transactions we put together prior to 2008. Others were transactions that we put together over the course of the past several years. But overall, having a lower hurdle to overcome from an upfront cost structure has been a very important factor associated with all that. And then finally, compensation. These are securities offerings, so we have a securities commission built into the offering structure. I think there are a lot of different ways to kind of skin this cat. I've seen brokers get involved in kind of an advisory capacity, evaluate the underlying fundamentals of the real estate, and in some instances be able to charge a client kind of a consulting fee. I've seen some brokers not even really want to kind of have that conversation. They're looking at this as just another arrow in their quiver as a way to maybe earn a listing to ultimately sell a property, or just provide a solution to a client that they've done a lot of business with and they'll likely do a lot of other business with. So it's not an easy answer, and I don't mean to dance around it, but from a sponsor standpoint, it's pretty clear cut. We have a securities product. We can pay a securities commission. So there's always a lot of conversation around that as commercial brokers get involved, and it's not uncommon for them to kind of have a conversation or a place at the table in that conversation. Yes, sir.
You say that you guys manage the structure of the deal, but you also had in there a master lessee. Is that the person that's managing the asset itself?
We use a master lease on operating assets. So, and I didn't get into this level of detail, but in the IRS ruling associated with DSTs, it basically hangs its hat on the Delaware Statutory Trust being a fixed investment trust. So what that kind of means from a practical standpoint is you can't re-tenant, you can't refinance, you can't do much of anything. So if you kind of take that at face value, how could you put a multifamily property in a DST? You're constantly re-tenanting, you're constantly leasing, you're constantly active. What the master lease accomplishes is kind of a workaround. So you have a master lease that's typically capitalized by the sponsor. All of the leasing activity takes place behind the veil of the master lease. And that's kind of a structural nuance of operating assets. So you're going to see master leases with short-term commercial tenants, multifamily, student housing, self-storage, really any asset with operating characteristics. And ultimately, the master tenant is an affiliate of the sponsor. So it's an inland affiliate. Yes, sir?
Someone 1031 exchanges in with debt, is there any provisions for the debt being paid down during the term of the ownership?
Yeah, every transaction is a little different. Almost all of our loans have an amortization component built into them. So most of my multifamily assets, I'll have a 10-year fixed rate loan. I'll have an interest-only period for maybe the early couple of years, and then it'll amortize over a 30-year schedule, so that you do begin to de-lever. You do kind of move away from the razor's edge of valuation concern, maybe if and when you have to refinance. And some of the highly leveraged deals, those have very heavy amortization associated with them. In fact, in some instances, they're self-amortizing. So if you're buying into a pool of commercial assets that have an 80% loan-to-value ratio, typically the loan and the lease term associated with your credit tenant are matched identically. And in theory, if you were to hold that asset through the term of the lease, the loan would be paid off in entirety. So it really kind of depends on the level of leverage, the asset type, but 9 times out of 10, we have an amortization component built into our debt structure. Yes?
Have there been any court cases recently on DST?
You know better than me.
I don't know.
Are you referring? Are you referring more on IRS side of things in terms of have they been contested or attempt to overturn a trade? Yeah, I haven't seen much of that. I know I'd be aware if I had an investor whose tax deferred exchange was overturned. Really haven't heard much in the way of rumblings. I even have less calls. I mean, there was a point where I felt like I was getting on the phone with the IRS agent to walk them through an audit and our deal structure. A few years back, it was maybe a monthly occurrence, and even that has kind of wound down. So I haven't seen much of that. Did you have something to add to that, Bob?
Yeah, on an individual basis, we've been doing this since the inception, and we have multiplicity of clients that are audits that are using this specifically as a template, and there has been nothing.
Yes.
Steve, I have one question for the group. The DST is often offered as a backup property in a 1031 exchange. Can you kind of share that last minute sticker shock in the event they do that as a backup property? How do they properly identify the DST?
It's pretty straightforward. You know, that's one of the avenues that I think the menu of options, having that actual transaction risk taken out of the equation for clients. You know, we purchase, and I should have said this probably earlier, we purchase every asset prior to offering it to investors. It's on our balance sheet, so we've closed. There's no seller involved. We've financed the transaction. It really is very turnkey. So from an identification standpoint, if you're listing a DST as one of your IDs, you can identify it the same way as another replacement property in terms of estimated ownership percentage, property, physical address, and it would be one of your 3 or more IDs if you're using the 200% rule or the 95% rule. I think that you use the word sticker shock in terms of what if it's kind of a backup and I'm jumping in last minute. We can act very quickly with the DST structure. The subscription process, the administrative process is fairly fluid. So I mean, we could sit down with a client today, do an application, and their closing will, if all goes smoothly, could take place by the end of this week. It really is that kind of seamless.
Well, my point was that the DST may have 3 properties in it. Do you identify the DST or do you identify the 3 properties?
That's a QI question. I don't get, from a sponsor standpoint, I like the notion of using kind of one portfolio DST as one ID. Some sponsor or some QIs take that position, some don't. Obviously, I like it because it provides more flexibility, but there really isn't a lot of consistency, at least as I've seen it throughout the intermediary. David, do you want to comment?
We had a conversation about a month ago with different people in the 1031 world, and we were talking about, actually, we were saying, we need to keep to work on this, get some letter ruling. Our position is if you're just IDing, like you said, a percentage of the thing, put a dollar value to it. It's not like you can pick and choose within that DST which property you're picking up. So we sort of unify it and say, look, if you can bust something up and buy pieces of it, then it's multiple. If you don't have that choice, it's all or nothing, then you can take that percentage and treat it like one. But I would like to see a ruling come out from the service that would support that.
The tough thing about that is when we're talking about tax reform and repeals, and I don't know how cooperative the IRS is going to be with us in terms of giving more guidance and more flexibility to deferring taxes. So I agree. At some point, maybe a different landscape, it might be a good time to attack that.
2 questions. One on the debt ratios. So each investor has a set debt ratio, and so the investor has to take the same debt ratio as the structure of the property is.
Correct.
And then, the second question is the holding periods. How do you determine holding periods of your investment?
That's a good question. So the first question related to debt ratio. So we don't have the ability to, I think there was a sponsor several years back that allowed investors to kind of mix and match. And that's the IRS is pretty clear that that's not allowable, that you fall into a kind of partnership land, if you will. So if you have a offering with a 60% loan to value ratio, every investor coming in will get their pro rata share of equity and debt, and they'll all have a 60% loan ratio. In terms of hold period, In today's cap rate environment, I set expectations for a longer term hold. Most of the financing we're lining up is at minimum 10 years in term. I would envision, I'm painting with broad strokes here, a 7 to 10 year hold period. I think that, especially with operating assets, that gives us enough time to, grow NOI, create value, manage the asset, and hopefully maximize value on the backside of the transaction. However, we're very active buyers, as I mentioned earlier. We're very dialed into the market pulse, and we take a very active portfolio management strategy. So there are a lot of transactions that I've pulled the trigger and we've gone full cycle on much sooner than that time frame I just set forth. So there have been transactions we've sold in as short a time frame as 2-3 years. There are transactions that have sold, or been held on to a little bit longer than that. But generally speaking, 7 to 10 years.
So the investor doesn't have any choice in that or any say in that, and
They do not.
and so it's pretty illiquid until the transaction is.
I'd consider this an illiquid investment. There's really not an established secondary market for fractional interest. It's probably a business opportunity for someone out there. I have seen fractional interest trade hands. The administration of that is really not that difficult. Inland can help to facilitate the administration. We can't get involved in pricing. So a lot of times if you have an owner that, their universe has changed, they need liquidity. They find a willing buyer, they negotiate a price, they call us, and they've got a deal lined up. We can help facilitate that, but those are more few and far between. In general, I would consider this an illiquid investment. Yes.
What are you looking for right now in the Portland metro or metro areas? That's how we can make money. Is just want to buy one.
I would love, I can't afford Portland, from a cap rate perspective. Love the market. I think it's got a lot going for it from a demographic, population growth, a lot, barriers to entry with the urban growth boundaries and everything else. But I've made offers. I've been priced out. I would consider, we've looked at a lot of multifamily assets. You were talking 200 to 300 units. Older vintage with maybe some value add characteristics. We've transacted in other markets similar to Portland where we maybe pay up from a cap rate perspective, but we have a light renovation plan where we, give the kitchen a facelift, new appliances, new flooring, talking $7,000 to $10,000 a unit, and we can provide a little NOI lift by pushing rents. But I keep striking out in Portland, so if you've got a deal for me, I'd love to look at it if the price is right.
And they should call you.
Yeah, I would definitely put you in touch with the right people, and yeah, I would love to talk more.
I think we're out of time. I'm sure Keith would be happy to answer some questions after, but.
Well, first off, before we end this whole thing, I want to recognize our newest designee that just got his pin. Brian, would you stand up, please? Congratulations, Brian. Well done. And I would like to offer a gift to our speakers. We appreciated so much you guys' willingness
No,
to
this
come
is
and
one of our
talk with us.
sponsors.
So please, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
Can we have a round of applause for our panel here? Thank you so very much.